Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2. Now, Book of Shadows came out in 2000, and this, of course, is the sequel to the 1999 found footage horror film, The Blair Witch Project. Now, Book of Shadows is actually not a found footage film like the first one was. This one is done much more like a traditional film, and that's actually something I really appreciate about this movie, that it didn't just try to repeat the same gimmick as the first movie. And keep in mind, at the time Blair Witch Project came out, found footage really wasn't a genre. It was really more of a filmmaking style and more of a gimmick that the first movie used, and a few movies that came out before the first movie also used. But once again, at the time the Blair Witch Project came out, it really wasn't a genre per se, so I really appreciated how this film didn't just try to repeat the same gimmick as the first one. Now, Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2 is co-written and directed by Joe Berlinger, who is actually primarily known for being a documentary filmmaker. Prior to this, he made a documentary called Paradise Lost, which was a documentary about the West Memphis Three. Now, this movie unfortunately suffered from a lot of studio interference because Joe Berlinger originally made this movie as kind of a satire on how the media shapes our perceptions of reality, and he also made it as a satire on the mass hysteria that came about because of the first movie. Like, he wanted this film to be much more of a satire and a social commentary, but the studio kind of forced him to re-edit the movie and make it more like a generic horror film. Now, Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2 is one of the most hated and maligned sequels of all time, but truthfully, and I know this is not a popular opinion, but I actually kind of liked this movie. I know it's not a popular opinion, but I really didn't think the film was that bad. Now, no, this is not the film that Berlinger originally set out to make, and apparently there is a director's cut, but unfortunately, the director's cut was never released. But truthfully, though, even in the theatrical version, you can still see the social satire that Joe Berlinger was going for with this movie. Now, Blair Witch 2 is not in continuity with the first one. Like, it's not set in the same universe as the first movie. In the universe that this movie takes place in, Blair Witch is just a movie, and it's kind of like Wes Craven's New Nightmare in a way. Like, in the universe of this film, the Blair Witch Project is just a movie, and the film is trying to make a commentary on how the Blair Witch Project, the first film, has affected pop culture. But one thing that's interesting, though, is even though this is not in continuity with the first one, even though in this movie Blair Witch was just a movie, it does appear that an Ellie Ketward still existed in the universe that this movie takes place in. Like, basically, this movie is playing on the idea that, yes, in this movie the Blair Witch Project was just a movie, but it's playing on this idea that what if the filmmakers behind that movie based it on a real legend, and essentially in this movie you see that legend that inspired the Blair Witch Project come to life. Now, the plot of Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2 is, in the movie you find out that because of the massive success of the film The Blair Witch Project, there's pretty much like this almost like mass hysteria that's coming up about because of the film, and you have all those people who thought that the film was real, and because of the success of the film, there are tour groups showing up all over the actual town of Burkittsville, Maryland, and they're taking people to a lot of the filming locations, and they're also taking people to the places where the actual Blair Witch legend started. Now, the movie follows this one particular tour group led by this guy named Jeff, who takes his group to the ruins of the House of Rustin Parr, because even though this movie is not set in the same universe as the first one, even though in this movie the Blair Witch Project was just a movie, it does appear that there was actually a man named Rustin Parr in the universe that this film takes place in. So basically in the movie, in the beginning of the film, they're camping out at the abandoned ruins of Rustin Parr's house, and there are these two characters in the movie who you find out were working on this book about the mass hysteria that the movie The Blair Witch Project brought about, and they get like really drunk one night, and basically they wake up the next morning and they don't remember what happened to them the night before, and they find the notes from the book that those two characters were working on all ripped apart, and the character of Jeff actually brought some camera equipment out to the woods, but he finds that completely destroyed, and they find like the tapes from his video cameras and stuff, and essentially in the movie they go back to Jeff's place, and he's actually living in like this old abandoned factory, but basically, in the movie, they're trying to figure out, like, what exactly happened to them that night, and throughout the film, each of these characters starts having what could be supernatural experiences. So basically, in the movie, something is happening to these characters, and is it like the Blair Witch? Like, is the legend true and the Blair Witch is kind of fucking with them, or is it something else entirely? And that's the basic plotline of Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2. Now, as I said before, Joe Berlinger, he made this film to really be a satire on the public's reaction to the first movie, and he also wanted it to be a satire on how the media really does shape our perceptions of reality. And he also wanted this to be a commentary on the dangers of blurring the line between fiction and reality. Now, there are 5 main characters in the movie: Jeff, Tristine, Steven, Erica, and Kim, and these 5 main characters, each of them are supposed to represent a different archetype. And once again, this film was meant to be a satire on how people base their views and perceptions on the media, and in the film you have all these supernatural elements, but the film is meant to kind of be ambiguous, where you're not sure if what's happening to these 5 main characters is actually supernatural, or if it's all some kind of group delusion brought about by their obsession with the Blair Witch Project. And there are certain elements in this movie that Joe Berlinger admitted that he'd taken from other horror films, like The Omen and Evil Dead 2 and The Exorcist, and once again, you're supposed to get the idea that the reason these characters are seeing things similar to what's in those movies is because, once again, it's a delusion, or you're supposed to think that it might be a delusion that's brought about by their obsession with media. And the film was also meant to be a commentary and a satire on all the people who thought that the first movie was actually real, because the marketing gimmick behind the first movie was that this was actual footage that somebody found out in the woods, and a lot of people actually believed that too, and this film was kind of making fun of those people. And one thing that's actually really interesting is, in the beginning of the movie, the character of Jeff is carrying around a video camera, and like there are certain shots in the movie where even though the film is not a found footage film, there's certain shots in the movie which are done from the point of view of this video camera, and Jeff has a really interesting line where he says, film always lies, but video always tells the truth, and that actually ties into the end of the film. Now, as I said before, this is one of the most maligned sequels of all time. Like, when this movie came out, it was pretty much bashed by audiences and critics alike. And when this movie came out, a lot of people complained about how it was basically just your typical horror film, but if you actually look at what the director originally intended, this was originally intended to be a much more subversive film, and once again, it was intended to be a satire. Now, a lot of the problems that this movie does have, and I do think this movie does have a lot of problems, a lot of them really weren't the director's fault. Like, there's a twist ending in the movie, and the movie itself kind of gives away the twist ending because they show you, because this was actually a studio mandate, like the studio forced the director to re-edit the whole film, so the film is edited in such a way where scenes that were intended to only be in the end of the film are scattered throughout the whole film, basically giving away the twist ending, and that wasn't the director's fault, that was something the studio forced him to do. And also, the tone of this film was supposed to be where the first half of the movie was supposed to be like a black comedy, and then by the second half of the movie it becomes more like a horror film, but the way the studio forced the director to re-edit the film, it ended up being pretty much more like your typical horror film throughout. But once again, despite its flaws, I actually really do like this movie because even though this is not the film that the director originally intended, you can still see the social satire that he was going for in this film. Now, even though I do like the film that we got, I do wish that they would put out a director's cut of this movie, or let the director of the film actually put out his cut of the film, because I do think if the director's cut of this was available, I really do think this film would be reevaluated by people, and I have a feeling that if they ever do release the director's cut of this, I have a feeling this film will have a fate similar to like Halloween 3, because Halloween 3 was hated when it first came out, but over the years people have seen what Tommy Lee Wallace was going for with that movie, and now Halloween 3 has a huge cult following, and I think if they were to allow Joe Berlinger to put out a director's cut of this, I have a feeling this film would also develop a cult following in the next few years. Once again, though, the director's cut of this film, unfortunately, is unavailable. So, that was my review on Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2, and my next movie review will be Blair Witch.